No mai haere mai, my name is Jeremy, and this is the Maxim Institute podcast. As one of our last truly public rituals, Anzac Day claims a sacred space in New Zealand's national attention. Over the past century, the commemorations have provided a powerful and imaginative story for New Zealanders. This story has shifted over the years, but retained central themes such as sacrifice, integrity, duty, and service on behalf of others. However, Anzac Day's history has not been an untroubled one. The day has been a cause for protest over time. While the sacredness of Anzac Day has been invoked to shut down debate, its annual liturgies of communal observance have also served as a potent platform for public exploration of contemporary controversies. By tracing some of the history of this continuity and change, we can see how Anzac Day has provided a forum and a set of rituals, traditions, and symbols to affirm our communities and, through a shared past, to negotiate and debate what it means to be a member of New Zealand society. This month on the podcast, I'm joined by the most recent addition to the Maxim Institute research team, Dr. Rowan Light. Rowan joined us at the beginning of this year, but this wasn't the first time that he and I had had a chance to work together. The quote that I just read comes from the article Protest and Patriotism that Rowan wrote for the 2018 volume of Flint Steel, Maxim's annual magazine. That year, we had chosen the theme of New Zealand's public square, looking at where and how we can talk about and debate the different versions of who we are and how we should live in a pluralistic culture. If you want to read Rowan's article in full, head to flintandsteelmag.com, or we'll have a link in the podcast notes for you to follow. Obviously, it's been 2 years since Rowan wrote that article, and I thought this year, leading up to Anzac Day, it would be a great opportunity to sit down and talk with him a little bit about what's changed in the meantime and his thoughts on the world that Anzac Day sits in now. For now, let's get into that conversation and how we commemorate the stories of the past in a present that's like nothing we've experienced before. Rowan, I think we first met to have a conversation about Anzac Day in a cafe underneath the University of Canterbury Library about this time in 2018. You've obviously got a lot of passion as a historian looking at this issue. What is it that made you interested in Anzac Day as a subject?
Well, I came actually to Anzac Day in quite a roundabout way. So I do have kind of a family connection to Anzac Day and the sort of history of New Zealanders in the First World War. My great-grandfather served at Gallipoli and my grandfather in the Second World War. But I actually came to Anzac Day as a subject in my university years, when I, in particular, in a kind of funny quirk, when I went actually on a student exchange in Dublin. And I was there as a student, and an exchange student, and I met an Australian historian called Mark McKenna, who was visiting as a kind of visiting on a kind of sabbatical of sorts. And he was running a course on Australian history. And so it was in that course, that as a New Zealander sitting in on this Australian history course, that Mark highlighted the kind of the central place that Anzac Day has in Australian culture. And what struck me then, as indeed today, is really some of the differences as well as the similarities. Of course, Anzac is a shared kind of practice. It's there in the name of Anzac. And yet I saw some differences and also some similarities in how a kind of national tradition of remembrance has changed over time. And it was in those conversations with Mark that led me basically to come back to New Zealand and having decided that I would investigate this difference and the similarity that Australians and New Zealanders share, realising that actually the history of Anzac Day wasn't something that New Zealanders had actually given a lot of thought to.
Yeah, and obviously I know a little bit about your work as a historian before coming on staff at Maxim Institute. But I mean, you took that interest in Anzac Day that you found overseas, and you actually ended up coming back and doing your PhD in that. So can you talk to me about a little bit about the posture that you took and kind of the questions that you had coming into that made you want to actually choose that as your thesis topic?
As I mentioned there, my interest in Anzac Day kind of came out of these broader questions, or this kind of broader encounter with Australian and then New Zealand history, and the kind of the sense of a shared space that Anzac kind of represents. But I suppose I was kind of interested as a kind of budding historian in questions of national identity, which were kind of quite personal to myself as a Pākehā New Zealander. And I was interested in a sense where, if in Australia, Anzac Day has kind of become in many ways a kind of central kind of national day. It has become more important in many ways than Australia Day to Australians. Contrast, New Zealand has this kind of mix of public commemorations around Waitangi Day as well as Anzac Day, and how these kind of fit into very different kind of national stories of how we see ourselves and the kind of where we see ourselves have come from. Because I suppose what struck me about the history of Anzac Day is that and what's kind of almost quite challenging about getting into questions of memory is that things which seem to us as how they've always been, that the kind of traditions take on this kind of power, that they are the way things are done and how they've always been, but actually in many ways the kind of national story of Anzac Day, the sense that Anzac Day is a day precisely which unites us as New Zealanders and as a nation, is actually quite a recent kind of development. And that's what struck me in my initial kind of engagement with this history, was actually realising it's been within a number of generations, there's been a shift towards seeing Anzac Day as a day of unity and a day of kind of celebration of kind of national values.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, growing up in the 90s, the feeling I definitely had is that the reverence for Anzac Day and that story of the World War I veterans had always been on kind of a consistent upwards trend in my lifetime. I mean, my parents are American, but I was born here and grew up here, so I didn't have that same sense of, my grandfather or my great-grandfather served in the war. But still, at the age of 19, I felt the pull, to go to a dawn service and just to commemorate that as kind of part of the sort of the Kiwi thing to do. So if you're talking about sort of how things develop, where did that ritual of the dawn service come from, and how did the sort of legendary or mythic sort of qualities of Anzac Day that we sort of enjoy or appreciate now, where did that come about?
To think about something like the dawn service. The dawn service is actually an Australian kind of invention. So it's one of Australia's great kind of exports.
Finally, something they can take credit for.
Yeah, so we should give them that credit. So it comes out of the 1920s, and it kind of jumps over the Tasman to New Zealand by the 1930s, and it's adopted as part of an emerging evolving set of practices around this thing that we now think of as Anzac Day, but was in that period before, or rather between the First and the Second World War, was actually something which was quite sort of different and developed over time. So we had in Australia, there's sort of the dawn service emerges from what's really broadly I would describe as kind of public Christianity. So this kind of it taking the form of the Anglican kind of liturgical rite of benediction, coming at dawn to commemorate the landing of the Anzacs at Anzac Cove, which was actually an Australian. So the Australians were the first to land at Anzac Cove. New Zealanders actually came later in the day, but so it kind of takes on a special kind of symbolism for the Australian kind of military experience of the Gallipoli campaign. It was also took on this kind of religious symbolism in being at dawn, the kind of as a sort of symbol of resurrection. At Easter time, we know, of course, that Easter and Anzac Day often fall kind of in the same time period, so that kind of gave this heightened sense of kind of the religious symbolism of this dawn service. And that also has kind of changed over time.
In the early years, when was Anzac Day as a sort of a day of commemoration that was a national day? When did that idea come about? Because obviously, we can think about it as this thing that's been in stone for our entire lifetimes, but obviously someone at some point had to have the idea, hey, this is the moment that we should commemorate. Were there other moments that were equally sort of worthy of commemoration from New Zealand's history that have sort of gone by the wayside?
The first Anzac Day is celebrated or commemorated in 1916, so as the war is ongoing. So that first anniversary of the Gallipoli landing, not long after the Gallipoli campaign had actually come to an inglorious end. And it was something which evolved over a number of years. It was interesting that it's always been invoked as Anzac Day. There were suggestions, particularly from British journalists, who said that actually this shouldn't be called Anzac Day, it should be called Gallipoli Day. And that actually speaks to a longer tradition of military commemorations where we have days which celebrate kind of campaigns or battles. So, for example, in that period around the end of the war, we still have traditions of things like Trafalgar Day, Waterloo Day. These were military commemorations that the Navy and the Army throughout the British in its various kind of institutional expressions and the British Empire would commemorate. And those actually they continue into the interwar period. We might point to days of commemoration such as Empire Day, which has since kind of ossified into Queen's Birthday weekend. But there was an attempt between the First and the Second World War to kind of find days of commemoration which placed these war experiences, in particular the First World War, and try to make sense of them through a whole collection of kind of cultural paraphernalia. And one of them was empire, and one of them we've touched on was kind of public Christianity. In New Zealand, I think what we also uniquely had, as in contrast to places like Australia, were actually early, quite nascent, but still established forms of military commemoration coming to us through by virtue of the New Zealand Wars. So early on in Anzac commemoration, we do see the sense of Anzac, the Anzacs at Gallipoli in the First World War, and in particular Pākehā and Māori kind of collaboration in the war as being an expression of a kind of a colonial kind of spirit which had emerged from those early wars of settlement. And it seems to us, sitting in 2020, we sit in a kind of weird, because for us the New Zealand wars are talked about as a history which has been forgotten, and it certainly is. But actually we had quite an established kind of military commemoration of the New Zealand wars up until really after the Second World War. So we have things like the Battle of Ōroko, which in some ways to me filled a similar kind of role as Gallipoli does to us today. It was a battle in which Māori were kind of celebrated as being glorious, valiant, defeated. They fight a battle to the most famously invoked in the kind of Wire's Last Stand, the kind of defiance to the end against the British soldiers, even against all odds, and eventually having to surrender and retreat, being a kind of almost a proto-Anzac myth. And it was told in many different ways in film and stories by historians as encapsulating a spirit of New Zealanders sharing in this kind of war experience, something which Māori and Pākehā would share, a kind of self-respect of each other. It's kind of interesting when we think about that, because some of those themes might sort of resonate with how we think of, we often hear when we talk about Gallipoli and the Anzacs, of the kind of that sense of valiant defeat. It is a defeat, the Gallipoli campaign. It's a bit of a disaster, we know that. There's also the sense of the respect between enemies, between the Turkish and the New Zealand and Australian forces. And that's sort of an appealing part of the story of Gallipoli that we often hear today. So, and also, of course, the idea that war experience, whether it's Gallipoli or Ōroko, kind of tells us something about our national character. Both of those, they're sort of a comparable, there's sort of certain resonances there. But just to answer your broader question, which was to say that these things are what are shaping Anzac Day in that early period of formation. And I suppose what's valuable to think about is that while we think of Anzac Day in very strong national terms, Anzac Day was part and parcel of a broader kind of cultural fabric, which saw New Zealand as part of a story of empire, of colonial settlements, and of a kind of pioneering society, as well as being a kind of budding national community.
You talk about the role of Anzac Day shaping our national identity and kind of this telling a story about who we are, but obviously there's lots of stories about who we are, and so I guess part of the choosing of which story you tell, there is a political or a culture making angle to that. In the article, you start out by talking about the statue of the untidy soldier that was in your neighbourhood when you were growing up in Devonport. What does that say about how New Zealanders, at a certain point at least, wanted to be seen and wanted to be thought of? You sort of touched on it with the pioneering, but what was it about the character of those sorts of commemorative acts, like building statues or certain types of parades and services? What were we trying to say about ourselves back then?
Well, I suppose it's a really fascinating thing, like looking at how a society looks to make sense of and then remember something as extraordinary and as terrible as the First World War. And that's when we if we look to in our local suburb or town, and we look at the statues and the monuments that were established between the First and Second World War, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing communities come to terms with mass death, with the wounds and of these communities. I suppose we could say a few things. One is that how did those communities make sense of that? We've talked about public Christianity, we've talked about empire. They tried to make sense of these experiences in quite local ways. So people didn't see themselves as we might talk about Anzac Day in kind of national terms. They saw themselves in quite local ways. So you cite there the untidy soldier. That was a monument raised to the men of Devonport. It was a monument dedicated to those men who came from the borough of Devonport back when it was a borough, and those men who served. And it was that sense of service, of kind of a civic service that they had committed themselves to. These were citizen soldiers. They were I suppose, a sense of that this is the ultimate expression of what it means to be a citizen. That was something that was actually shared by many Māori leaders who saw the First World War and particularly the Second World War as an opportunity to participate in citizenship, and that through sacrifice and that sense of duty and sacrifice came with it rights and responsibilities of citizenship. So even in the unveiling of the untidy soldier, we see there, as I mentioned in the article, Paul Māori, who was the native minister at the time, who essentially talked about this sense of that Māori commitment in the First World War had been this expression of a shared citizenship. There's also an interesting aspect of this, which is, and this comes back later when we think about some of the protests and the conflicts, is that in this kind of emerging landscape of commemoration, as you rightly point out, there's a process of kind of remembering but forgetting as well, because societies and communities can't, and even in our own selves, we can never remember the past in its total. We just can't fit it all into the same kind of picture. We have to pick and choose to make sense of the past. So communities necessarily omitted aspects of that war experience. In particular, in something like the untidy soldier, what do we see? We see a soldier. We see a statue of a kind of military experience of the First World War. But of course, the First World War wasn't just something which affected soldiers on battlefields. It was something which actually encompassed all communities. So there was a negotiation in a way, and a kind of politics of memory, in which those who had been left behind, mothers, wives, for example, who had to kind of look to find a kind of a place within this new kind of commemorative landscape.
That reminds me of a statue that's actually on Simon Street in Auckland of there's a plinth that you'd normally see a soldier on top of, but instead of this being a soldier on top of the plinth, there's actually this statue, a bronze statue of a woman standing next to the plinth with her arm raised as if to sort of gesture to the absence of the sort of man that would normally be on top of it. And I remember the first time I saw it just being so struck by how different that was, the different story of war and loss and sacrifice that it told.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned that statue. That is actually and that's actually a New Zealand Wars commemoration. But I think when you look at it, I think it's very natural to see it within that First World War iconography. But it would have actually been a memorial which was raised within the 10 years or so of the First World War. So it's actually commemorating earlier conflict, but within that kind of period. So we're seeing. But it is true. It is very true that we tended to see. That's one way that those who had been left behind, so to speak, on the home front, were able to kind of carve out a role within this commemorative landscape, was as mourning, as the kind of mourners of loss, and that's a very powerful kind of archetype of kind of interwar commemoration. And even today, I think this image of the mourning woman, and that's something which we see come through in the protest era. You see it, I think, even today, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, in terms of Jacinda Ardern's kind of posture as a kind of mourning mother figure of following March 15. That to me was very much reminiscent of that kind of role that of a kind of mourner.
I definitely want to come back to how those sort of archetypes have followed through to the last 2 years. But before we get there, I just want to go back to the title of your article, which is Protest and Patriotism. And it kind of gives away your thesis that Anzac Day isn't just about the way we commemorate war heroes, it's also been a site of protest. And when we were talking about Flint and Steel and the magazine looking at the public square, obviously a lot of the public square is where we have some quite sort of fractious and tense debates about what we value and what we think is good in society. And obviously Anzac Day over the decades has been the site of a lot of protests. And why do you think that is? What is it about Anzac Day that offers people, or I guess challenges certain people to go against the tide of what most New Zealanders are doing in commemorating that day?
That's very interesting. I mean, there's a few layers there. One, I think, is worth pointing out, which is, as you've said, like the public square as I think, almost by definition, the place where we work through differences. That could be a way of thinking about what the public is. It's where we agree with what kind of keeps us together, and in doing so we define what we don't agree with. So kind of that mix of orthodox and heterodox. We kind of define, well, what are we for? By definition, we are defining what we're not for. Now, commemoration and memory and history are very powerful tools for shaping public consensus, because they are shared languages and shared practices and shared rituals, shared stories, which we can use to make sense of change and debate. They're things that people can grasp onto. They're often associated with places, so places where people meet and imagine themselves in a kind of community and having a kind of relationship, like we talked about with the untidy soldier. Politicians and community leaders kind of meeting together around this statue, articulating these relationships of political citizenship. So that traditions, particularly commemoration and particularly war commemoration, because of this sense of the giving of life, kind of is a natural, I think, quite organic sort of sources of kind of public relationships. Now, why Anzac Day? Now that kind of goes to today. Why is Anzac Day why does it seem such a rich sort of source of that making of kind of public consensus? Well, I think part of that is explains the big shifts that we've seen in New Zealand society since the Second World War. So if we had public Christianity, if we had this kind of story of almost romantic kind of unity between Māori and Pākehā, of empire, framed in this big grand story of empire in that interwar period that we've talked about, those kind of pillars, which is kind of an image that's used in the article, kind of fall away one by one in many ways, or in a very interconnected kind of way in the kind of post-war period. And within that comes a kind of both a search for new stories to make sense of change and big changes over time, particularly the end of the British Empire, which is something which we don't tend to really appreciate, I think, as New Zealanders, how fundamental a kind of cultural paradigm shift that represented in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Part of the interesting question here is, why does Anzac Day kind of seem to be the kind of lifeboat that we are drawn to? I raise some examples of that sense of the way that Anzac Day, since over the 1960s and 70s, and what was a really period of immense kind of change for New Zealand society and around the world. It's a period which comes with varying changes, social, economic, cultural, in which we saw there emerge kind of generational kind of critiques of different aspects of our society. So we saw, for example, in the context of the Vietnam War, which was a war which a great many New Zealanders supported, but there was a kind of a significant minority who disagreed with the Holyoake national government's involvement in the Vietnam War. We saw kind of for the first time, if the First World War and the Second World Wars had seen quite a kind of public consensus that these were things that the nation we needed to get behind as a nation. In the context of Vietnam, we saw kind of emerging disagreements about whether New Zealand should be involved in that conflict. So we saw in the context of the Vietnam War, student groups who opposed the war and opposed New Zealand's involvement in the war, co-opting Anzac Day rituals and such as the laying of wreaths, and there was student groups in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch would lay wreaths which aimed to commemorate civilians who had been killed in the conflict in Vietnam. So, we think of the quintessential kind of American atrocity of the My Lai massacre by American soldiers. These were kind of events which were capturing the imaginations and the kind of sense of indignation of young New Zealanders in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And these young New Zealanders sought to include the victims of kind of the civilian casualties of war within this kind of ambit of commemoration that was Anzac Day. And so we see there what was both a co-opting, they're engaging in practices familiar to their audiences, to their mothers and fathers and community leaders, the laying of wreaths, but in a way which actually was extending or changing the kind of focus of commemoration. So we see there an example of shared practices but being used in a kind of different kind of sense.
Going back to the experience of Anzac Day in our lifetime and how we've sort of seen it increase in public value almost in terms of the participation in dawn services, and I guess the rise in young people who weren't necessarily, they're a couple of generations removed from the actual events of Anzac Day, actually going along and seeing this day and this remembrance as having value. In the article, you talk about the fact that the Clark government actually seized on this and really purposefully invested in the storytelling of Anzac Day. Can you describe kind of what happened there and what you sort of saw as the impetus behind that?
What you're describing there is really the shift that starts in the 1990s. So if we've just in 2015 commemorated the centenary of Anzac, in 1990 marked the 75th anniversary of Anzac Day, which is not the most auspicious anniversary, but it was a significant one enough that the Australian and to a much lesser extent the New Zealand governments engaged in what was really the first big state commemoration at Gallipoli. So we have in 1990, Bob Hawke, the Australian Prime Minister, becomes the first Prime Minister to be at Gallipoli at the dawn service in time of Anzac Day. So the 1990s, a period of kind of big change. There's different ways we could talk about this. I mean, one is that there's different ideas of how memory operates over time. Historians sometimes talk about social memory or social remembrance as practices which are shared by those who experience, say, a historical event, say those soldiers of the First World War, which we've talked about, and this kind of role that they formulated for themselves as kind of citizen soldiers, and that was expressed through kind of communities and networks like the return service organisations, such as the RSA, most prominently in New Zealand, and the families and then the churches and all the different communities that kind of interacted through a kind of social networks of memory. But as you say, well, what happens to social memory and those communities of memory when those who are kind of the vessels of that memory, those who experienced those events, start to die? And that's kind of a crucial period when historians suggest that social memory starts to either disappears because you no longer have the kind of glue that keeps that purpose of that remembrance together, or it becomes something else. It becomes something more cultural. So it starts to become detached from experience and starts to be expressed in cultural practices and traditions over time, which are increasingly kind of disconnected from social experiences, and takes on a kind of much more kind of almost cosmic kind of significance for communities.
The word myth comes to mind because obviously when a story is disconnected from the actual person who lives it and who could tell it, other people have got to pick it up and start to pick out which aspects of what they've heard they're then going to pass on. And so then it becomes a sort of a myth making. Talking from the 90s, you also have sort of worldwide cultural touchstones that start to emerge like Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan, which are not about the same events, but you've got a similar sense of wanting to put in place artifacts of memory that sort of contain retain the experience that we're wanting to remember. And so, I mean, in the article, you sort of note that Saving Private Ryan comes into a moment where New Zealanders are sort of getting more interested. And then obviously the Clark government in the early 2000s have that ceremony for the tomb for the unknown soldier. Can you describe a little bit around what led to that happening and what it meant?
What you've identified, which is a big global shift, and what's been described as really a boom in memory towards the end of the 20th century. And that's very much related to those events which you've touched on, the world wars, but also things like the Holocaust, these kind of mass experiences, these very traumatic moments in the 20th century, which are both demand of us to recognise and to grapple with, but are also incredibly difficult parts of the past to deal with. So we have what's this big global memory boom, but which takes on very different, distinct kind of local flavours, and as you've identified in New Zealand. So you mentioned there the tombing, the repatriation and the entombment of the unknown warrior in 2004 by the Helen Clark Labour government. That's a really interesting event, and to me encapsulates really the big shift that we've seen in Anzac Day in its 100-year or so history. We see that repatriation is in part a co-option, once again, of what the Australians have already done. So just like the dawn service is that import into our Anzac Day repertoire, the repatriation of the unknown warrior is also kind of a little bit of a reaction to what the Australians have already done in 1993. So in 1993, the unknown Australian soldier is repatriated by the Paul Keating Labour government, and it's interesting that these are both Labour governments seeking to kind of, in many ways, reconcile the nation in this act of repatriation, to reconcile, later rest, the sense of the national past. And here, literally embodied in the bones of this unknown warrior in 2004. There's the sense of kind of that powerful, I think, image and powerful practice of what it means to bury a human body there in that act in 2004. Burying the bones of a person, in fact, digging up the bones of a person, which is also what they did in those repatriation acts, is one of the most intimate claims you can make on a person. If we think about our loved ones, to bury them is a profound statement of care and also responsibility and kind of a sense of custodianship, almost stewardship of those human remains. So some of that, I think, is captured in the power and the emotional appeal of repatriation. There's the sense of this is the nation reaching back into its past to find a kind of almost a whakapapa, a genealogy in which the soldier embodies this kind of the generations of war dead who are then brought back under the authority of the government and the nation, and then buried at Pukeahu National War Memorial in Wellington. And the sense of that powerful claim of on place that act represents, I think, is not one to underestimate.
You've talked about Australia, the unknown soldier, but obviously there's a different word that you've been using for ours, and the fact that it's unknown warrior. What's the intent do you see behind that?
In the mid-2000s, we're seeing this attempt through lots of different parts of New Zealand society, an attempt to reconcile our past of settlements and colonisation and a recovery and a newfound respect for the Treaty of Waitangi. So there's this kind of interesting little intersection here of a new bicultural public at the turn of the millennium. So this, again, the sense of reconciling the nation, reconciling its past through this unknown warrior. And we actually see that if you have a chance to actually visit the unknown warrior tomb. And it's very much a bicultural, sculptural, it's very much respectful, but it's also a very kind of material, kind of tangible place where you go and you kind of, you can touch this tomb and you will see the karanga, the call, which is inscribed on the tomb, referencing this kind of call, this return of this unknown warrior back into service, as Helen Clark talked about. We're calling this unknown warrior back to serve the nation again as the symbol of national unity, one which evoked a kind of biculturalism.
Obviously, in the 2 years since we published your article, Anzac Day commemorations have actually been significantly disrupted. First by last year's March 15th moth shooting, and now by COVID-19 this year. Looking back at what you wrote, how do you respond to the events of the ensuing years? And how do you think that Anzac Day commemorations might actually be impacted by what we as a nation are currently going through? And how can we draw... Is there a way that we can, that Anzac storytelling capabilities and the way that we sort of publicly talk about our national identity on that day will be influenced by these massive events and sort of in our history?
Well, it's been a massive 2 years, hasn't it? It's really, there's so many things we could touch on. It's also, just to kind of return to the reason why I looked at Anzac Day as a topic for a PhD is partly because it's something which is evolving and changing over time, which makes it a very exciting thing to consider. Well, we could think about, of course, we've seen, on the one hand, what we've seen are two very significant kind of state commemorations. We've seen the end, of course, of the Anzac centenary period, or the period of commemorating the First World War, finishing in 2018. And that was New Zealand's biggest public commemoration in our history, even bigger than the centenary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1940. It's a really big kind of landmark of state investment in kind of cultural narratives of our nation. That is significant. And even so, in many ways, we're still kind of dealing with the aftermath of that. We're still coming to terms with how that has shaped our understanding of Anzac Day. We could think of something like the Te Papa Gallipoli exhibition, which came out of that period. What does that tell us about the sort of shape that that centenary has given to how we think about Anzac Day and the First World War? Well, I would say it's drawn quite a clear line between national identity to the place of Gallipoli and the heroic kind of figures of those who engaged in the conflict, the Anzacs. We've also seen the Tuia 250 state commemoration, commemorating a different kind of story of almost a different kind of foundational story of the New Zealand nation, which ties to that of the discovery, so to speak, by Captain Cook of New Zealand on behalf of the British Empire. A very powerful and very complicated story which has been told and commemorated over the last century. In which I think saw kind of quite a different kind of approach in many ways to commemorating, one which tried to be much more inclusive and include hapu and iwi perspectives. What those big state commemorations show us, even as we still kind of come to terms with what they actually meant for us as New Zealanders and kind of some of the conflicts which came out of those commemorations, what they point to is the way that commemorations provide us with kind of commonality, shared stories, shared points of reference that can then be, as we've talked about, then used as a kind of way to engage in critiques of our society. So we saw in the last couple of years debate around the actions of the New Zealand Defence Forces in Afghanistan, highlighted by the Operation Burnham inquiry, which is still ongoing. And we saw how that protests on Anzac Day and say highlighting once again kind of civilians' casualties of war and the extent to which we can include those within the ambit of a military commemoration, or whether Anzac Day can encompass more than just soldiers. And of course, perhaps most importantly, of course, we've had March 15 and this kind of terrible event which we're still coming to terms with, which has been, again, has provoked really interesting debates about who is included in Anzac Day in this commemoration, and how do we commemorate the past.
Just reflecting on the events that you're just describing there, it seems to me that there is something about collective suffering that we are much better at marking and commemorating in New Zealand than we are at celebrating publicly. Is there something about a commemoration of something that is somber that you think fits more squarely with the New Zealand identity than a celebration?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think there is something to be said about that. I mean, going back to the comparison between Australia and New Zealand, what's striking in Australia, as I mentioned, is that Anzac Day is a day to celebrate Australia in a way which I think New Zealanders would find quite jarring. We like to think of Anzac Day, as you say, as a sombre, as a day of sorrow. And I think that language of sorrow rather than of pride is probably the vocabulary that we would draw on in our own commemoration in contrast to Australia. So there is definitely a tradition, I think, a kind of genealogy, which is one of mourning and sorrow rather than of kind of celebration. It is interesting that if we look at the First World War commemoration of the World War 100 centenary kind of program, so much was emphasized, so much of the emphasis rather was placed on 2014 and 2015, the kind of front ends of the conflict. But we barely invested in the commemoration of the end of the war, what should have been the kind of main celebration, the end of the war in 2018, but it kind of ended with a bit of a whimper, in part because all the cash and all the emphasis had been spent, and all the enthusiasm had been spent much earlier. But I think you've touched on what is partly we've talked about myth and the ways in which stories are supposed to convey certain things to us. And I think the kind of pathos of war and of the kind of sacrifice on behalf of others is a very powerful sort of sentiment. We often hear, that's probably one of the ways that the Anzacs are most invoked, I think, in our culture. We hear invariably those who sacrifice their lives in some way as a kind of as the Anzac spirit. That's something we hear. I think of John Key, after the 2011 earthquake in Christchurch, invoked the Anzac sort of spirit as in invoking the kind of the ways in which people in Christchurch had kind of suffered, and also the emergency services who had kind of responded to the disaster.
Well, there's a unity in mourning, isn't there? There's a direct humanity in marking and memorialising loss. And I just think about sort of the difference between the 200th celebrations of the landing of the Endeavour, or the sort of the voyage of the Endeavour to New Zealand, which was much more sort of a time of confidence and pride in a sort of assumed national story. As we've sort of grappled with that and realised that our national story is not unmixed, can't be viewed with a sort of unmixed delight, that the 250th Tuia 250 commemorations were not able to be a similar sort of celebration, because we recognise that there's something to be grappled with before we can actually move forward with confidence in telling a national story that we can celebrate.
Exactly, and I think what's probably changed in those last 50 years is really the voice of Māori, and that have been ultimately quite disruptive of those kind of celebratory narratives, and the ways that those have forced all New Zealanders to contend with, as you say, the less comfortable aspects of our past, to own them and to deal with them in a public way, a process which I think is still ongoing. And we could point to the Waitangi Tribunal settlements and the ongoing kind of demands to include the New Zealand Wars within a kind of commemorative day. We now have Rā Maumahara, the Day of Remembrance, the Day of Commemoration of the New Zealand Wars. Of course, we've got this look to redesign New Zealand history in our schools as part of that. But we do, I think I think you're really right there, that there seems to be less capacity for us to have a kind of monolithic story, which is just kind of celebration. I think you could draw a bit of a contrast to Australia again, where I think they're still going through a process of recognising at a kind of constitutional level those the kind of the wrongs of the past through those experiences of colonisation and war in Australian history itself, not overseas, not in Turkey, but on its own kind of in its own places, in its own among its own people. So definitely, I think there's that's been part of the appeal of Anzac Day in Gallipoli, is that it does kind of in some ways export our history and export our national identity in a way which does kind of a little bit jumps, potentially sidesteps some of the trickiness of our national past, by making the stage of our national kind of story not, Taranaki or Waikato, the sites of of the bigger conflicts of the New Zealand wars, but of the Gallipoli Peninsula, fighting heroically in this kind of conflict.
It's going to be interesting to see in the next couple of years how the this sort of 2-year gap of 2019 and 2020 of missing out on sort of our national kind of, these sort of practices that we have around the dawn services, how that's going to influence the future commemorations and memory of Anzac Day. But for you this year, you're not going to be able to go to a dawn service. Is there any way in particular you're going to be commemorating or marking Anzac Day?
Yes, well, I mean, it's true what you say, and you've highlighted an important thing which has taken place in the last couple of years, which has been this disruption of Anzac Day following March 15. There was the kind of debate whether Anzac Day ceremonies should be held, and in fact only very limited numbers went ahead because of security concerns. And then again, once again, we've seen a disruption of our commemorative kind of rhythm in the lockdown. I think there's a few things that we will. I mean, one is that communities are very creative about how they commemorate. I think we will see quite creative responses in the lockdown. I mean, I think one story that has been, again, which actually started in Australia but has kind of jumped the Tasman, was the idea of people standing at the end of their drive. Or at some part of their property in place of the dawn service and coming out at 5 o'clock or 4:45 on Anzac Day morning to mark this commemoration. I think, there's been different other ways that I've seen just online, people kind of coming up with different ideas of how they intend to commemorate. I always try to reflect on my own family history on Anzac Day and those parts of my family who have, particularly my great-grandfather and my grandfather who served respectively in the First and Second World Wars, and I remember them on Anzac Day, and that's what I will do this year.
And possibly some biscuits if you can find some flour.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Rowan. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and enjoy the rest of your lockdown. We will talk to you again. Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. As I said at the top of the podcast, if you would like to read Rowan's article, Protest and Patriotism, just head along to flintandsteelmag.com and you can find a full back catalogue of our previous Flint and Steel articles. So if you're a bit starved for content over this lockdown period, there's some great reading to be found there. If you'd like to keep up with what the team has been writing and reading and doing over the last month, just sign up for our monthly forum email. You can go to maxim.org.nz and we've got a sign up form there. From all of the team at Maxim Institute, mā te wā, goodbye for now.